Hey guys, Luke Johnson here from Noetic, the Humanities Teaching app, joined by CJ Eller and Jordan Cline. We are going to conclude our discussion of Michel Foucault's What is an Author? And just to refresh, what did we ended off last week discussing 3 of the 4 characteristics of the author function. And just to recapitulate those 3 that we covered were that the first was that the author came into existence as a result of intellectual property laws and that discourses can be appropriated. The second was that the author function affects different discourses differently and can evolve over time. If you think of how ancient texts were once considered authorless and science had an author, and now how that relationship has flipped in the modern scenario. And then the third is that there are complex rules for author construction that depend upon the discourse. How the philosophical author emerges might be different than how the poetical author emerges. Foucault thinks the drive and the methodology to construct authors came from the efforts to legitimate the books of the Bible. So this sets us up for the 4th characteristic. And I've got a quote here from page 113. I'll just read that and maybe allow CJ and Jordan to say something about it, and then I'll fill in some parts here. Yeah. And then I'm going to describe what I'll do after that, and do after that, instead of talking about the text itself.
Wonderful.
Dad jokes. All right, page 113. He says, "It does not refer purely and simply to a real individual, since it can give rise simultaneously to several selves, to several subject positions that can be occupied by different classes of individuals." All right, CJ, Jordan, what did you make of that?
Well, Foucault describes different ways that can happen in different texts. So when we think of, say, a mathematical text, he describes that being that there's a self in the preface that describes what's going to happen. And then there could be a self, for instance, that says, "I conclude blah, 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 blah is true," and that's as a second self, for instance. And then there's this other self as well, and I'll quote Foucault, where he says, "We could also, in the same treatise, locate a third self, one that speaks to tell the work's meaning, the obstacles encountered, the results obtained, and the remaining problems. This self is situated in the field of already existing or yet to appear mathematical discourses." So he sort of alludes to a concept we'll brush upon later, but at least in regards to mathematical treatise, he explains how there are these different selves that are at work, different authors at work that have different functions within one text in and of itself. Because at least for me, I thought he was going to just talk about the novelistic self, or just talk about, how are there different selves in a narrative. But then he says, well, it's not just in novels, honey. It's in everything that you see, that there's these different selves working. And mathematical texts or scientific texts seem to be one example of such.
Yeah, I think that was a good thing to point out. The thing that I want to make which I'm not clear on yet, something that you said that I think bears some sort of elucidation. Where the author function is present, I don't necessarily think that means that there are multiple authors. That may mean that there are several subjects, like you alluded to. If you switch to a mathematical text, that there may be a different person that speaks in the preface, a different person that speaks with the universal voice, and then one that does the... You got all that right, but it seems like to me where the author function is present, you're going to have this variety of selves. Now, when the author function is not present, when we look at scientific writing or something like that, you're not going to have this multiplicity of selves. Like when you look at like a science paper or something like that, that personal pronoun stands there without an author or a function.
Okay. I know he says something along the lines of...
I could be wrong. That was my interpretation.
No. Let's see what Foucault has to say. Maybe this helps. He says on 112, "In fact, however, all discourses endowed with the author function do possess this plurality of self." So I don't know if that means...
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Well, I was going to say, on 113, the top, he says, "The author function operates so as to affect the dispersion of these 3 simultaneous selves." So I thought what was interesting was the function of time, and like the author function, and that's something that I wanted to look into more. But I thought it was really cool that there can be there's a multiplicity, but that multiplicity can coexist all at the same time.
Because of the author function. So it's not so much the author function is the author, but is a function or an action that allows these different selves to maybe coexist in one work or in one person, I suppose.
Like think back to, like, if you guys check out our discussion of Bohr Hayes' Bohr Hayes and I, right? Like there is Bohr Hayes, who stands for this author function. Now, he's not like this one-to-one correspondence with the real world, and we talked about that in the previous podcast. But there are at least 2, maybe 3 selves within that Bohr Hayes and I piece, right? Just to kind of link all these different universes together, right? So we could say there is this thing that stands for Bohr Hayes. That's the author functioning, and then it is divested into this multiplicity within that 3 paragraphs that we looked at or something like that? Yeah. So that's the way I understood it. That you have multiple selves, but not necessarily multiple authors.
That makes sense.
But you can't really...
Well, it's like almost having like a split personality.
Yeah. So, may I move on, or are we?
Yeah, no, because I think then he just outlines the 4 characteristics of the author function, and he makes sure that we remember what those were.
Yeah, which I think we have all now. So, moving on, Foucault notes that he could have elaborated, and I thought CJ did a great job about this in the first installment of this, talking about how the author function can be applied to all these different mediums. I think you had a little bit of a digression, a very helpful digression, when you started to analogize how the author function could work in painting and sculpture and music and stuff like that. And Foucault kind of laments the fact that he doesn't have the time to really dwell on that in this particular essay. I wonder if Barth and other individuals take that up in the text. What was the Barth that we looked at? Image text.
Image, music, text.
I bet there's an essay in there where he deals more with that outside of writing. And so, like, Foucault laments that he thinks that the meaning of what the author has been limited too much. He says on page 113, he wants to kind of expand upon what we have so far. He says on page 113, I have discussed the author only in the limited sense of a person to whom the production of a text, a book, or a work can be legitimately attributed. It is easy to see that in the sphere of discourses, one can be the author of much more than a book. One can be the author of a theory, tradition, or discipline in which other books and authors will in their turn find a place. These authors are in a position which we shall call transdiscursive. Okay? So that I think is a very important passage. For my own self, I might have to read it again just so I get my mind around it. I have discussed the author only in the limited sense of a person to whom the production of a text, a book, or work can be legitimately attributed. It is easy to see that in the sphere of discourses, one can be the author of much more than a book. One can be the author of a theory, tradition, or discipline in which other books and authors will in their turn find a place. These authors are in a position which we shall call transdiscursive. Sorry for the repetition, but I felt it was worthwhile. Now, he gives us some examples, right?
Sure.
What are some of the examples that he gives us of people that might be transdiscursive, people that might be the authors of a tradition or something, or a theory or something like that?
I think the most curious one is Aristotle, because if we know a little bit, and maybe Jordan can help me out on this, the books that are, like Nicomachean Ethics, all those books, most, if not all of them, are just written down from his students. Is there any truth to that? I don't know. That might not be true.
I don't know if that's true.
Shoot. Well,
I think you may have.
Maybe I'm confusing him with Plato.
And Aristotle and Plato.
Okay. Well, even if he did or he didn't, I think of Aristotle in the sense that we think of his theories or his thoughts. We don't necessarily think of Aristotle, the author of Nicomachean Ethics. We think of like Aristotelian universe, or we think of Aristotelian logic.
Yeah, Aristotelian thought.
Yeah, just thought in general. Yeah, just that whole scope of things. So I think it makes sense in that regard, at least for Aristotle. I don't know if you wanted to.
Well, yeah, some of the other examples that he uses are Homer, the Church Fathers, some of the first mathematicians, originators of the Hippocratic tradition. But he then says, like, these are not inclusive of that. There are other types of authors that he has in mind, and they're not just great literary authors or authors of religious texts or the founders of science. Well, Jordan, what does he call them?
Aren't they just like discursive, right?
Yeah, but what he's got a name for it. The founders
of discursivity.
Right, yeah. So, okay, so we've got this special category, founders of discursivity. Jesus, that's a hard word to say.
Tongue twister.
Especially when you're drunk on insomnia. So, yeah, all right, so these founders of discursivity, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. And he gives us, there's this great passage on page 114 that I think is illuminating. It says, they have produced something else, the possibilities and the rules for the formation of other texts. In this sense, they are very different, for example, from a novelist who is in fact nothing more than the author of his own text. Freud is not just the author of the interpretation of dreams. Marx is not just the author of the Communist Manifesto. They both have established an endless possibility of discourses. Okay? So we've got these individuals that come to stand for something very different. All right? And that people who identify themselves as Freudians or Marxists, good Lord, it's late. This means that people do more than merely imitate, but can disagree with these founding individuals on their own terms within communism or psychoanalysis. Mm-hmm. And in this way, it seems that the founding of a discourse is similar to the founding of a science. But there is a difference with science. He says that the founding act in science is on an equal footing with what follows it. To quote him on page 115, the founding act of science can always be introduced within the machinery of those transformations that derive from it. Now, I tried to come up with an example of this, right? Like, we talk about Freud all the time. They can have like all these different sort of flavors of Freudian thought, or all these different flavors of Marxism, or something like that. But like when you're talking about like founding a science, you don't necessarily attribute it to an individual, right? Mm-hmm. Like quantum theory, right? Like there are just like these sequence of individuals that keep supplanting what came before it. Like the origins keep getting modified by what comes after it. So there's not like this person that we say that we identify solely with quantum theory or you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean it's in a way I think Foucault puts it in three ways where he says like, science can be further explained as a rule. Like maybe somebody comes up with an idea, like maybe quantum theory, a very vague idea of quantum theory, and then somebody comes in and explains it even more. And then there could be a bug in that theory. Yeah. And then somebody could change it. Future iterations could change it.
Or we do build super colliders and find out even more information about the nature of atoms and the constituent elements.
Yeah, and then maybe in doing that we have to limit the information that we get from the super colliders. So that's another way, is that we can limit the information that we receive. That, okay, maybe it's too much, that's too broad, let's bring it in. But that's exactly what you're saying, but I think Foucault just presented it in all these different ways and different flavors. But yeah, it does derive from this fact that it can be modified all the time by future traditions, or not future traditions, but just future transformations.
Yeah, so we have to ask ourselves, and Jordan, I'm going to bring you back into the conversation here. I mean, it's not like... So what's the difference between that and, say, like Freudian thought or Marxist thought or something like that? Like when we find like gaffes or things that we think are erroneous about founders of discourses, right, or founders of discursivity, how are they treated differently than science? He gives us a little bit of a hint here on page 116. I don't know if you have the same quote as I do. The one that when he talks about trying to seize the act of founding. If you can't locate it, I can just read it.
Yeah, why don't you just go ahead?
Okay. Instead, when trying to seize the act of founding, one sets aside those statements that are not pertinent, either because they are deemed inessential or because they are considered prehistoric and derived from another type of discursivity. Right? So, like, yesterday I was having this conversation with Robert Schutt about Kierkegaard, and he was asking me if Kierkegaard was anti-feminist or misogynist or anything like that. And one of the ways that I handle Kierkegaard and his author function, right, is to sort of overlook any of those passages that may seem to be unnecessary to what he's doing. And presumably there's all that sort of stuff in Freud and Marx as well, right? Mm-hmm. So this is how these founders of discursivity are treated differently than, say, the founders of a science, who are constantly being cannibalized by the own mechanism that they set up. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's sort of an element of sort of objectivity too with the science. I mean, it's kind of like what we talked about with Augustine, like a number. No one disputes 7 + 3 = 10.
Yeah.
So I think that there's sometimes with psychological theories, there's still like a level of subjectivity that we might be able to call into question, dispute, but with a hard science, you can't.
Yeah, you can only add to it or try to, limit it, but yeah.
You can modify it, or I guess like refute it, to some sort of degree.
But you're still working with it.
You're still operating within the system.
You don't have to pick and choose or cherry pick what you want to take from that discourse or from Freud or from Marx to get some kind of derivation from it.
Yeah, I think Jordan hits the nail on the head precisely, and Foucault says on 116, as a result, one defines a proposition's theoretical validity in relation to the work of the founders, while in the case of Galileo and Newton, it is in relation to what physics or cosmology, what Jordan pointed out as the objective verification, is. It is in the intrinsic structure and normativity that one affirms the validity of any proposition that those men may have put forth. So, I totally correct there, Jordan. So, we move on to Foucault's conclusion. Are there any questions about what we've said so far here about these founders of discursivity and the transdiscursive? And
yeah, I think one thing to add, I think we're maybe implying that a lot of it is just saying like, yes, Marx is right, so I'm just going to continue on with that plane of thought. That it can also be a negative thing as well. There can be something where you say, no, I disagree with Marx, and I'm going to change it in my way and make it into something else.
And that's very interesting how we have paradigm shifts. Like how did would you say that Jung is a founder of discursivity, or are there? I don't know enough about this divide between Freud and Jung, but to say that they are separable founders of discursivity, or is Jung just a Freudian?
Right, exactly, a different kind of Freudian that took. Yeah, it just creates this odd universe where you could say you could say certain thinkers aren't exactly founders, but they're mere, like you said, Freudians who decided to cherry pick such and such a thought and decided to go a different way. And he makes another fascinating point, which I would like to bring up about this idea of returning to origin, in the sense that we can also go back and change our, and it goes back to science as well, where he's like, we can I think he says, let's see, on page 116, he says, re-examination of Galileo's text may well change our knowledge of the history of mechanics, but it will never be able to change mechanics itself. On the other hand, re-examining Freud's text modifies psychoanalysis itself, just as re-examination of Marx's would modify Marxism, in the sense that we can go back and read them in a different way, and that we can, in a sense, modify the text. So that's quite a powerful statement.
Isn't it called like intertextuality, when you insert yourself in the text and like in the act of reading, you're sort of modifying the text itself?
Yeah, right? No, that's a big thing. Bohr Hayes was about, and is one of my favorite stories of his is Pierre Menard, the author of the Quixote. And I think I've mentioned it to you guys before, where this one author, his claim to fame is that he wrote 2 or 3 pages of Don Quixote word for word, but not just from memory or just from some kind of weird thing. And the author, or the person doing the essay, was able to parse out like, oh well, Quixote, or was it Cervantes has this one way of saying it, but look at Pierre Menard, he's being ironic and quite distasteful with his use of this language. So in a sense, like, you can go back to the text, but like you said, intertextuality, you can put something in differently, or you can have a different interpretation and change that and modify it. That's really cool and very
I think
crazy.
It's terrible. I'm glad you brought up that tension between like how going back to the origins of something in a founders of discursivity can reframe the conversation, whereas it does not reframe the conversation in science.
Right, or it's more like you get the history of science rather than an actual change of the mechanics.
Yeah, you don't have to like doesn't cause like a radical shakeup to go back and revisit Galileo or whoever founded quantum mechanics or something like that. Mm-hmm. So in Foucault's conclusion, he asks, why does he attach so much importance to this particular lecture that he gives us? And he gives us some theoretical reasons. They all kind of hinge together. Mm-hmm. But what he thinks he has done by this examination of the author function is that he has given us a methodology for the typology of discourse, which is something I never ever thought about before looking at this essay. Yeah. And that such a typology has to include more than grammatical features, formal structures, and objects of discourse. And there are properties, relationships specific to discourses that we can use to distinguish them. And one of those is what we've been talking about, is the relationship or lack of relationship to an author. And depending on the relationship to the author, we get the existential mode of the writing, right? He says on page 117, the manner in which they are articulated according to social relationships can be more readily understood. I believe in the activity of the author function and in its modifications than the themes or concepts that discourse is set in motion. And the second thing, do you want to jump in there, CJ or Jordan?
No.
The second thing, do you mind? The second thing that Foucault wanted to accomplish with this essay is that he wants to tear down the author's ideological status. This is where we get political Foucault, that he's, the anti-fascist Foucault, that he thinks something about the author is this ideological production, and that he's going around trying to deconstruct what the author really is. And on page 119, he says, so like, this whole thing is like this act of political rebellion, by this an absolute form of leveling. He says on page 119, the author is not an indefinite source of significations which fill a work. The author does not precede the works. He is a certain functional principle by which in our culture one limits, excludes, and chooses. In short, by which one includes the free circulation, the free manipulation, the free composition, decomposition, and recomposition of fiction. And so, like, in closing, Foucault envisions a future where we no longer really consider the author, and we stop asking about him, right? Mm-hmm. And so he thinks that in the future, and maybe that future is now, maybe it's not. I don't think it is, because honest to God, had we not had our attention directed to these essays by my good friend Lindsay, I don't know if I would have thought about things this way. It's very uncomfortable, especially when you're doing philosophy that is trying to get at the epistemological reality of everything. But he thinks that in the future, there are really going to be 4 questions that we're going to ask ourselves instead of who wrote this. We're going to ask ourselves, what are our discourse's existential modes? Who can appropriate a discourse? Within a discourse, where is the space for a subject? Mm-hmm. Right? Like that math book and all the different spaces for subjects there. Mm-hmm. And who can appropriate those subject functions? And that's pretty much the end of the essay. Yeah. I don't know about you guys, but I found this and the BART and all the stuff that we're doing on lit theory, it's totally messing with my way of understanding how philosophy is done. So, especially since I read Kierkegaard so closely. But that's what I have. I'll leave it to you guys to kind of munch on what I just said there.
Yeah, well, I'm curious how that changes the author function of Kierkegaard for you in some respect, especially since we're dealing with an author who plays with pseudonyms a lot and different functions within, like we said, the dispersal of persons, or the intertextuality of having all these different voices. I'm wondering how reading Foucault has changed your perspective on Kierkegaard, at least as an author, quote unquote author.
I want to step back and look at it. I can't really say right now.
No, okay.
I know that's kind of an unsatisfying answer.
No,
I think it would be more interesting to me if I knew that Kierkegaard didn't eventually come out and say where he stood on the issues.
Right, yeah.
Because he did write a book called My Point of View as an Author or something to that effect.
Dang
and he says something to the effect of, well, look, I was a religious author all along. Don't really take anything that any of these pseudonyms take seriously. What you really need to take seriously is, this.
But that presents a very interesting.
Yeah. I'm not saying it's not unproblematic.
No.
I'm just saying that had he not written that, I think it would have been more disorienting for me. But the more interesting thing is what value, at least in relation to Kierkegaard, do we give all his different pseudonyms? Do we hold them each in the same esteem as like the person that writes my point of view as an author?
Right.
Like when he talks about being a rake, when he talks about being an ethical man, when he talks about being like sort of deistic or ethical religious or whatever it is, are all these on the same footing as Kierkegaard, the religious author, even though he directly signs that he is a religious author?
And would those questions still be under the aura of the author?
Yeah, that
right?
would be.
Yeah, because it's still like, you know, who really spoke? Is it he? Is it Kierkegaard, or is it someone else? You know, we're still playing in that La La Land, and I think maybe that's what I found so fascinating is that, like, you know, reading that little part where it's like, we're no longer going to ask, like, who really spoke? Is it someone else with all, you know, with what authenticity or originality? I was like, it's like we were flirting with all those questions in the Bohr Hayes and I discussion, which is kind of funny. We're like, oh no, we kind of fell in with those questions.
Yeah, we should revisit something after. Like we're gonna do some. I think we're agreed that we're gonna do some Derrida.
That's gonna be interesting.
Yeah, that's gonna be interesting. So we'll do some Derrida next, but I think it'd be interesting at some point for us learning what we have learned from Barthes and Foucault to now like revisit something that messes with our conception of the subject and the author and see if we can apply some of these themes to it. Maybe we'll find a short story in Kafka or something like that, or maybe you'll think of something, CJ, that would scramble our neurons on this.
Yeah, I'm curious, Jordan, what you I know it's such a dense work. I mean, I'm still trying to wrap my mind around it, but was there anything that stuck out to you when sort of exploring this?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's really unsettling, but I don't know, and this is kind of like a weird way how I relate to it, but I think of it in terms of like medieval architecture. So the idea is that with a lot of medieval architects was the fact that once you built a facade for a cathedral, you seldom ever signed your name to it.
Yeah.
And so then if I think of in that framework and just letting, the absolute last sentence of Foucault poses the question, what difference does it make who is speaking? So that idea of just letting the grandeur and the topography of sort of a text just kind of like play out and unfold before your eyes without really sort of infusing it with the question of an author and just letting it speak for itself.
There's such a beautiful moment in this one video essay, documentary, movie, whatever you want to call it, called F is Fake, or F for Fake by Orson Welles. It's like one of his last movies, but there's this moment when he's admiring the chart, I guess the church, the medieval chart, and he's just saying, like, wow, like if we had to choose something to memorialize humanity by, it might as well be chart or something similar to that. And he's like, how fascinating that there isn't a name on it's an anonymous work where it's just like maybe the name isn't so important after all, that we didn't need to say, oh, this is by Picasso and this is like represents humanity, but that it was just this anonymous work that in some way embodies who we are, and that maybe a name isn't so important after all. And I don't know, maybe there's a bit of fear because it almost seems anarchic, or like, where it's just like, no name, we're all gonna just go crazy. Man, I think he references that too, where he's like, it would be pure romanticism, to imagine a culture in which, in quoting Foucault, the fictive would operate in an absolutely free state in which fiction would be put at the disposal of everyone and would develop without passing through something like a necessary or constraining figure. So he kind of admits too, he's like, this might not happen, but there's something to it. I don't know. I don't even know if we'll get to that point. There might always have to be some kind of power that gets in the way, or at least messes with it. And I think that's maybe a part of it that I'm fascinated about with this essay. I don't know about you. I know you and I were kind of talking about that, Luke, about this idea of power. And Foucault's, we might explore his whole idea about power. Right. It's complicated in of itself, but there's this tussle between.
Right. Yeah. We were, Jordan, I love the fact that you brought up architecture. Yeah. Because that's something that I don't think Foucault mentions. So you're even bringing in more things, and how we sort of in retrospect we put that all together, right? But there's like so many. I always find it interesting, like when you look at a structure or something like that, and you find like maybe a worker who's like signed his name in concrete, or like their little personal touches of other people. But we say, oh no, there's this hypothetical or theoretical figure that really put it all together. Right. And we were joking about it earlier, how like maybe we're founding, or maybe I, right, Luke Johnson is founding a discourse, right, by this creation of this teaching and social media platform, right? But that's kind of a lie, right? Because like I couldn't have done it without you two, right? Like,
sure.
Like we're all kind of.
And maybe
there'll be legal things that say that it's but like really, in reality, could I have done this without you?
Sure. Or could you have done it without Mark Zuckerberg? You could have done it without the person that invented the internet? You could have done it without the person that invented the idea of information? Could you have done it without Leibniz? Or like the person that invented binary theory? It's just like what another thing I find so fascinating is that there's all these different like founder, and then like he's a guy that kind of took off from another discursivity. It's all these different trees. It almost seems like trees built upon other trees, built upon other trees, upon other trees. Where it's like I think you can simultaneously be a founder of a discourse
and participate
and participate in countless other discourses. So it's like you can just like
it's like the splitting of the eyes, like you can be at different places all in one. Yeah, you can kind of have like one foot in one discursivity and then like in another. And just kind of like maybe like just navigate and exist in multiple ones at the same time.
Yeah, totally, and no. But I mean, that was the thing that I thought maybe I wasn't clear to me from the Foucault, right? Like we're all like, okay, cool. Like Freud is definitely a founder of discursivity. Why? Like, why is Freud a founder of discursivity, and like maybe it's up for debate that Jung is or is not? Like, what is it that Freud is doing that's so original?
And I think that's where the
was he not influenced by somebody?
Right.
Because what have we found over and over again when we study philosophers? They almost always had someone else that they were responding to, right? Like Schiller's responding to Kant, Kant's responding to Hume. Like it just goes on and on and on.
Well, isn't that always? I think within all fields, there's that phrase where all of blank is a footnote to blank.
Yeah, right? And all philosophy is a footnote to Plato, right?
All music is a footnote to Bach, right?
Is that what they say?
Or sometimes they say
that. They say that?
Or that it all
Bach
goes,
is the Plato of music?
Or it all goes back to Bach. And
what about for history, Jordan?
I don't know.
Does it all go back to Josephus? Or who? Or...
no, I don't know. I think it's like storytelling, basically.
Yeah.
For history, it's like, I don't know.
It all goes back to oral traditions.
Does everybody have a founding father?
Yeah, I don't know.
Herodotus or Thucydides are like the big. Herodotus or Thucydides. Those are like the two like fathers of history.
Interesting.
Yeah, but I mean, I think what Foucault is in a sense. I mean, he's almost building a discursivity just by having you ask a question about that. Okay, like, how do we know who is a founder of discursivity? That's another field of study, right?
Do you think Foucault starts one?
Well, I think he started, by you asking a question about it, and let's say, hypothetically, you did research and did something on that. Like, Foucault would be the founder, I think, in some respect, because you went off of what he said.
He's just responding to Barth. This lecture is a response to Barth's death of an author. So is it Barth's discursivity?
Right.
It's like a Gordian knot, Yeah. Where does it start?
Yeah.
Because he admits that.
Where somebody just like to use the sword to cut it when you need it.
I think Barth might, not Foucault, but maybe Barth, at least on this matter, might be the founder. I don't know. I mean, look, I've read 2 essays on literary theory. I'm not some expert.
Yeah, and who knows what was going on. But I think that's the, well, who cares what it was, but I think it proposes different questions. Like Foucault said, where we're not so much concerned with style in the sense of, let us read this text and understand who's, like how that person said it, or, who is the author, or even music. Like, we're not going to just listen to music. Now we're going to be more concerned with maybe there's this one book, I can't remember her name, something Denora, but she wrote this book about Beethoven, sort of recent, that talked about the historical impact, or at least like who are the people that he was around with? What were these situations at the time, and how did that all benefit Beethoven, or what environment was Beethoven in for him to create that music? And it's so funny when you look at Amazon reviews, people say she doesn't explain the music. Like, there's no mention of the music in this. Like, there's no musical examples. Where it's like, it's almost in the sense where we're so focused on. I mean, I think it outlines this divide, right, clearly, where it's like, I want to know about Beethoven, I want to know like the musician and the composer and the music. I want to get into that, or like the who really spoke. Is it someone else? Blah blah blah. But like, she's trying to get into the environment of that discourse rather than the discourse itself. So I think that's it creates, at least this essay for me creates a lot of different questions that people can go further with in their own respective fields, which is crazy. Yeah,
most definitely. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, yeah, it's crazy. I really enjoy this discussion. Might want to start to bring it to a close. I think we're running up on 40 minutes or something. But
okay.
I don't know, Jordan. Did you have anything else that you wanted to say?
No, I mean, I just think that for me, that's just kind of like a paradigm shift in and of itself. I've never thought about literature and through this sort of lens, so it's totally game changing for me.
It's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. What the cool thing is that we're documenting ourselves all along the way, so we'll see how our attitudes evolve. For me, I'm someone not comfortable with ambiguity. Like, I'm comfortable with being like, what does something say? What is the essence of a thing? So we'll see. Like, maybe I'll become, I don't know, maybe I'll become a totally different Luke now.
I get Stockholm syndrome with tech, so I'm probably gonna I'm gonna go down the rabbit hole with this.
Yeah, we're gonna be unrecognizable to ourselves.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else, CJ? Good. Guys, I really like this. It was a good one.
I did too.
It was a good one.
Same.
Hopefully we'll get into the Derrida with as much passion and intensity. I think we will. People seem to like that stuff.
It'll be intense.
All right, thank you for listening. Download the Noetic app, please.
Yay!
Round of applause.